The operating room fell silent, except for the muffled laughter from the surgical team. "Look who they assigned to assist," the lead surgeon whispered, not bothering to hide his contempt. "The new girl. Bet she's never even held a scalpel properly." They saw a young woman, barely 30, who looked like she belonged in pediatrics, not a high-stakes trauma surgery. What they didn't know was that those same hands had performed life-saving procedures in the back of blacked-out helicopters over Afghanistan. But when the patient, a decorated Marine, was wheeled in and began to crash on the table, their arrogance turned to panic. And as his eyes fluttered open, he would say something that would change everything these doctors thought they knew about the quiet new surgeon. If you believe heroes are forged in the moments no one sees, subscribe to our channel. We tell the stories of the quiet professionals who change the world when the pressure is at its highest. The operating room at Chicago Memorial was a temple of modern medicine. Gleaming chrome, state-of-the-art monitors, and perfectly calibrated instruments lay in sterile, orderly rows. It was a world of precision, of control, of predictable outcomes governed by protocols as rigid and unyielding as steel. And it was a world where Dr. Sarah Cross felt like a foreigner in a strange land, a soldier trying to find her footing on unfamiliar, deceptively peaceful terrain. The muffled laughter from the surgical team was a familiar sound, a language of exclusion she had learned to understand long ago, both on the battlefield and off. "Look who they assigned to assist," Dr. Richardson, the head of trauma surgery, whispered to his resident, his voice a low, more condescending rumble that carried easily across the sterile field. "The new girl. Bet she's never even held a scalpel properly." Another voice, belonging to Dr. Ames, a senior surgeon with a reputation for sharp-tongued cynicism, chuckled from across the table. "Hope she doesn't faint when we open him up. This isn't like patching up a scraped knee in the clinic." Sarah's jaw tightened beneath her surgical mask. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the meticulous, almost ritualistic arrangement of her instruments. Her hands, which had been the subject of their mockery, were perfectly steady, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a deep, almost unconscious competence. They saw what they wanted to see: a young woman, barely 30, with a quiet demeanor that they mistook for timidity. They saw someone who looked more like she belonged in pediatrics than in the brutal, high-stakes world of trauma surgery. What they didn't see were the ghosts that stood behind her, the silent, unseen figures of the men and women she had fought to save. They didn't see the dust and chaos of a field hospital in Kandahar, a place where the air was thick with the smell of blood and cordite, and the only light came from a single, swaying bulb powered by a noisy generator. They didn't see the 8 years she had spent as a combat surgeon, performing emergency thoracotomies in the back of shaking helicopters, her hands steady, even as the world outside was consumed by fire and violence. Here, in this gleaming, pristine hospital, she was not Major Cross, the decorated surgeon who had earned the respect of hardened soldiers by pulling them back from the brink of death. She was just the new hire, an outsider they could dismiss with a casual, thoughtless cruelty. The patient who was wheeled in changed everything. The trauma bay erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. The calm of the morning shattered by the urgent reality of a life hanging in the balance. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. A paramedic rattled off, his voice tight with urgency, as he and his partner transferred the bleeding, unconscious form to the operating table. As the team swarmed the gurney, cutting away clothes, assessing the damage, and calling out vitals, Sarah caught sight of the patient's face, and her blood ran cold. She knew that face. She knew the faded, worn dog tags hanging around his neck, the ones she was now carefully lifting to place on the instrument tray. This was the soldier who had carried 3 wounded Marines to safety while under heavy fire in Kandahar, a man whose quiet courage had become a legend in her unit. He had earned a Purple Heart for his own wounds and a Bronze Star for his valor before his medical discharge. And now he was here, bleeding out on a gurney in Chicago, 1,000 miles and a lifetime away from the war that had defined them both. As they prepped him for surgery, her mind raced, the combat surgeon within her taking over, analyzing, assessing. The entry wounds, the pattern of the shots, it was all wrong. This wasn't a war wound. This was something else, something closer, something more personal. But before she could process the thought, the doors to the operating room swung open. Dr. Fars, Richardson stood at the head of the table, the undisputed king of his domain. He looked at Sarah, his eyes cold and dismissive over his mask. "Just try to keep up, Cross," he said, his voice laced with a final parting shot of arrogance. And then he made his first incision. The moment Dr. Richardson's scalpel touched the patient's skin, the fragile stability of Lieutenant Webb's condition shattered. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the metronome of life in the operating room, accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched alarm. The numbers on the blood pressure display began to plummet, a digital waterfall of impending death that sent a ripple of panic through the room. "He's bleeding out faster than we anticipated," Richardson muttered, his confident, almost theatrical demeanor beginning to crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead, a stark contrast to the cool, controlled environment of the operating room. He worked with a frantic energy, his hands moving through the patient's chest cavity, searching for the source of the massive hemorrhage, his movements becoming less precise, more desperate. "BP is dropping to 60/40. The anesthesiologist called out from the head of the table, his voice tight with a concern that was quickly turning to panic. "Heart rate is climbing to 120. We're losing him." Sarah watched from her position as the second assistant, her mind a cold, clear instrument of analysis. Her trained eye, honed by years of making life-or-death decisions in seconds, immediately identified what the lead surgeon was missing. The entry wound pattern, the trajectory of the bullets, the subtle, almost imperceptible way the patient's chest wall moved with each ragged breath. It was a story she had read 100 times before in the blood and dust of Afghanistan. Richardson was looking in all the wrong places. He was following a textbook protocol, a clean, orderly set of rules for a clean, orderly world. But this was not a clean wound. This was the dirty, chaotic, unpredictable reality of high-velocity trauma. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the screaming monitors. She stepped closer to the table, her presence a small, calm island in a sea of rising panic. "The bleeding might be coming from the intercostal vessels. The trajectory suggests—" "I didn't ask for your input, Cross," Richardson snapped, his focus still buried in the patient's chest. He didn't even look up. "I've been doing trauma surgery since before you graduated medical school. Hand me a clamp." The other surgeons remained silent, their faces hidden behind their masks, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her. They were waiting for her to back down, to retreat to her designated place as the quiet, invisible assistant. But Sarah had never been one to back down, not when a life was on the line. She had learned her medicine in places where ego was a luxury no one could afford, where the only thing that mattered was keeping the patient on the table alive for one more minute, one more hour. The monitors continued their urgent, relentless warnings. Lieutenant Webb was dying. "Where is this bleeding coming from?" Richardson whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. His hands, which had seemed so confident and steady just moments before, now trembled slightly as he probed the wound, his search becoming more frantic, more desperate. Sarah made her decision. She could not stand by and watch a fellow soldier, a hero, die because of one man's pride. She moved closer to the table, her voice calm but firm, imbued with an authority that made the resident beside her flinch. "Sir, with respect, we need to explore the posterior chest wall. The angle of entry suggests damage to the vertebral arteries. If we don't find it now, he won't make it." "That's enough, Cross." Richardson's voice rose, a sharp, angry crack in the tension-filled room. "You are here to observe and assist, not to play trauma surgeon. Now step back and let me do my job." But as if summoned by the conflict in their voices, Lieutenant Webb's eyes suddenly flew open. The anesthesia was failing, his body fighting through the sedation with the last of its strength. His eyes darted around the room in a wild panic, finally focusing on Sarah's face above her surgical mask. A flash of recognition, as sharp and clear as lightning, cut through the fog of pain. His hand shot up, grabbing Sarah's wrist with a strength that was shocking for a man who was bleeding to death. Through the endotracheal tube, he managed to force a sound, a desperate, gargled word that everyone in the room could understand. "Doc, Cross," he gasped, his voice a bare whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Afghan, she saved us." The entire surgical team froze. Richardson's hands stopped moving. The room fell completely, utterly silent, except for the relentless, screaming beep of the monitors. Lieutenant Webb's grip tightened on Sarah's wrist, and with a final monumental effort, he spoke again. His voice louder, clearer, a command from the brink of death. "Call Dr. Cross. She knows combat trauma." In that moment, every assumption, every condescending joke, every dismissive glance the surgical team had directed at the quiet new doctor crumbled into dust. The mocking whispers died in their throats. They were not looking at a new hire. They were looking at a combat veteran, a surgeon who had earned her credentials in the most unforgiving classroom in the world. Dr. Richardson's face had gone pale behind his mask. His eyes met Sarah's across the operating table, and for the first time, she saw something other than arrogance. She saw fear, and she saw the desperate, unspoken plea for help from a man who suddenly understood that his patient's life depended on an experience he had never had. "Dr. Cross," Richardson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what do you need?" Sarah didn't waste a single second on explanations or ego. The monitors showed Lieutenant Webb slipping further into hemorrhagic shock, his life measured in the frantic, rhythmic beeps that were growing weaker by the moment. Every moment of delay brought him closer to the point of no return. She stepped forward, her military training taking over, a switch flipping in her mind that transformed her from a quiet assistant into a commanding officer in a mass casualty event. "I need a thoracotomy tray and 2 units of O-negative blood, stat," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with a practiced authority that made the entire room snap to attention. "And someone call the blood bank. We're going to need at least 6 more units on standby. Now move." The surgical team, which had been paralyzed by indecision just moments before, moved with a new and desperate purpose. The mockery and doubt that had filled the room had evaporated, replaced by the focused, almost frantic intensity of a team that had been given a new, clear mission. The resident who had joked about her fainting now rushed to get the thoracotomy tray, his hands shaking more than hers ever had. "The entry wounds suggest the bullets fragmented after impact," Sarah explained as she worked, her hands moving with a speed and precision that was breathtaking to watch. It was a muscle memory forged in the crucible of combat, a skill honed by performing these same procedures under the dim light of a field tent, with the sound of enemy fire in the distance. In Afghanistan, we saw this pattern constantly. the primary bleeding isn't from the obvious wounds. It's from the secondary damage caused by bone fragments acting as projectiles inside the chest cavity. Dr. Richardson watched, his initial shock giving way to a dawning fascination and a profound, growing respect. He assisted her, handing her instruments, his movements now deferential, the movements of a student observing a master. Sarah's technique was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was economical, decisive, and brutally efficient. Every cut, every clamp placement was exactly where it needed to be, with no wasted motion, no hesitation. "Jesus," whispered one of the residents, watching from the edge of the sterile field. "Look at her technique. It's flawless." Sarah found the source of the bleeding within minutes. It was a severed intercostal artery, hidden behind a jagged fragment of rib bone, exactly where she had predicted it would be. As she worked to repair the damage, she continued to teach, her voice a steady, calm presence in the high-stakes drama. "In combat medicine, you learn to read the story the wounds tell you," she said, her fingers moving with the delicate grace of a master weaver as she sutured the damaged vessel. Civilian trauma often follows predictable patterns, but military trauma is different. High-velocity rounds don't just punch holes. They create cavitation effects, a shock wave that damages tissue far from the apparent injury site. You have to think three-dimensionally. You have to think like the bullet. As Sarah controlled the bleeding, the frantic beeping of the monitors began to slow, returning to a more manageable, life-sustaining rhythm. Lieutenant Webb's blood pressure started to climb, moving from the brink of death back toward the realm of the living. "His pressure's coming up," the anesthesiologist announced, his voice filled with a relief that was almost palpable. 110/70 and climbing. Sarah allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile behind her mask. She had seen too many good soldiers die from injuries that were survivable with the right knowledge and quick action. Lieutenant Webb wasn't going to be one of them, not on her watch. As she began to close the surgical site, she was aware that the entire team was watching her every move, their earlier mockery replaced by an intense, almost reverent silence. The transformation in the room was complete. She was no longer the inexperienced new hire. She was a combat veteran, a master of her craft, a surgeon who had earned her expertise in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Dr. Cross," Dr. Richardson said as they prepared to move Lieutenant Webb to the recovery unit. "I owe you an apology, we all do." Sarah looked up from her final sutures, her eyes meeting his across the table. "No apology necessary, Doctor," she said. "We all want the same thing, to save lives. But maybe next time we could skip the assumptions and just focus on the patient." The surgical suite erupted in quiet, relieved laughter. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Actually," she said, pulling off her gloves, "there's something else you should know about Lieutenant Webb's case. His injuries weren't from enemy fire." The room fell silent again, the new mystery hanging in the air. 3 weeks later, the sterile, quiet halls of Chicago Memorial were a world away from the tension of that operating room. Sarah was making her morning rounds when she saw a familiar figure in the hospital's physical therapy department. Lieutenant Webb was working with a walker, his movements slow but steady, his face set with a look of grim determination that Sarah recognized all too well. His recovery had been remarkable, faster than anyone had predicted. But Sarah knew that the discipline and mental toughness forged in the military often produced results that surprised civilian medical staff. "Dr. Cross," Webb called out when he spotted her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Come see how your handiwork is holding up." Sarah entered the therapy room, a warm sense of satisfaction washing over her. "The physical therapist says I might be able to go home by the end of the week," Webb said, his voice filled with an enthusiasm she hadn't heard before. "First good news I've had in months." "That is good news, Marcus," Sarah agreed, reviewing his chart on her tablet. "Your latest imaging shows complete healing. You've been an exemplary patient." Webb paused, his smile fading slightly as he sat down, his expression turning serious. "Dr. Cross, Sarah, I need to tell you something. When I woke up in that operating room and saw you there, it wasn't just relief. It was hope. For the first time since I got back from Afghanistan, I felt like maybe things could work out." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of being someone's lifeline, a responsibility she had carried through 100 firefights and 1,000 surgeries. "Marcus, you saved yourself. I just provided the technical expertise." "No, it's more than that," he insisted. He looked down at his hands. "Do you know what I was doing the night I got shot? I was walking to the bridge over the Chicago River. I had decided that maybe everyone would be better off if I wasn't around anymore." The confession hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had suspected that Webb's presence at the convenience store hadn't been entirely coincidental, but hearing him confirm her fears made the successful surgery feel even more significant. "But then I saw that kid with the gun, threatening that old man behind the counter, and something inside me just clicked. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I wasn't just a broken-down veteran, I was a Marine, and Marines don't walk away from people in trouble." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Richardson. He approached with a formal document in his hands, his earlier arrogance replaced by a warm, collegial respect that had defined their relationship since that day in the operating room. "Dr. Cross, I'm glad I found you. The hospital administration has asked me to discuss a permanent position with you. Head of Trauma Surgery, with a focus on developing new protocols for treating combat veterans in civilian medical settings." The offer caught Sarah completely off guard. She had been working on a temporary contract, filling in while the hospital searched for a permanent chief. The idea that they not only wanted her to stay, but were offering her a leadership position was more than she had dared to hope for. "We've seen a significant increase in veteran patients," Richardson continued, his voice filled with a genuine passion she hadn't seen before. "Your unique background makes you the ideal candidate to lead a specialized program. We want you to train our staff to teach them what you taught us in that operating room." Lieutenant Webb was grinning from his chair. "Sounds like the hospital finally figured out what the Army knew 8 years ago," he said. "Dr. Cross is one hell of a surgeon." As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about the mocking whispers, the dismissive glances, the constant, exhausting battle to prove herself. It all seemed like a distant memory now. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. A chance to build something that would help other veterans like Marcus Webb to bridge the gap between the world of combat and the world of civilian medicine, a gap she herself had struggled to cross. "I accept," Sarah said, extending her hand to Dr. Richardson. "When do we start?" 6 months later, the Marcus Webb Center for Combat Veteran Medical Care was officially dedicated at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The ceremony was a testament to the transformation that had taken place, not just in one patient's life, but in the entire culture of the hospital. Lieutenant Webb, now fully recovered and working as a counselor for transitioning veterans, stood at the podium. 8 months ago, I was ready to give up," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I thought I was just another casualty of war. But this hospital, and specifically Dr. Cross and her team, didn't just save my life. They gave me a reason to keep living." Sarah watched from the front row, wearing her dress uniform for the first time since leaving the Army. The rows of ribbons on her chest, the combat medical badge, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, told the story of her service. Dr. Richardson, now her colleague and friend, leaned over. "The program has exceeded every metric," he whispered. "We've had inquiries from 17 other hospitals wanting to implement your protocols." Sarah smiled. The mockery that had greeted her first day had been replaced by respect earned through competence. But more than that, it had been replaced by lives saved, by futures restored. The laughter had stopped, and the healing had just begun.